No one is incapable of becoming a leader. It's not about where you start, it's about where you're going and where you finish. Hello everyone, my name is Trevor Harold, and today I'm here to tell you the story of a truly exemplary individual. A true transformational leader, one who understood this reality and had an absolutely stellar finish. This man was Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was born a slave in South Carolina in 1839. He and his mother, Lydia Polite, were owned by a man named Robert McKee, who historians believe is most likely Mr. Smalls' father. McKee decided to send Mr. Smalls to work in Charleston as a laborer. He did various jobs, finding a wife named Hannah Jones who worked in a nearby hotel. Eventually, he landed at a shipyard in Charleston Harbor. In the long term, sending Robert Smalls away would be McKee's critical mistake. One thing we need to understand, Robert Smalls was a visionary. Despite being born into slavery, he saw a life of freedom for himself and especially for his family. And he saw that it was possible. During the Civil War, the Union had set up a blockade around the harbor where he worked. And he realized that if he could reach that blockade, that vision of freedom would become a reality. This man, having built a foundation of trust among the officers on the Confederate ship he worked on, the Planter, organized the ship's crew to prepare for just the right moment. Now see, Mr. Smalls knew the Confederate officers would leave the ship some nights to go ashore, leaving only the enslaved crew on board. He also knew the Confederate signals for fort passage. So one night, when the officers left under cover of darkness, he gave the signal, and the slaves on the crew took over the ship. He stole and donned a leftover officer's uniform from the ship, and then he gave the correct signals at all 5 forts they passed along the way, including the heavily guarded Fort Sumter. Mr. Smalls sailed his way to freedom. He liberated his family as well as the ship's crew and their families. He more than earned his freedom, but the thing that's incredibly impressive to me is that Mr. Smalls was not done. Mr. Smalls went on to persuade President Lincoln to allow black men into the Union Army. He himself became a general and recruited a battalion of 5,000 free black men fighting for emancipation and a better world. After the war, he began a political career in which he served as a representative for South Carolina in the United States House of Representatives for 5 terms. While there, he continued the fight to improve racial equality. This is why I say Mr. Smalls is a transformational leader. He had a vision for a better world, one he continued to dedicate himself to create, even after what many in his case would have considered an impossibly good achievement. If you've read my paper on Robert Smalls, you already have a pretty good idea of his transformational leadership in the case of his escape from slavery. Because of this, we're going to try to focus more on his life after the escape in this presentation. Now, there are 4 factors one must consider when discussing transformational leadership: idealized influence, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, and individualized consideration. And Robert Smalls exhibited all of these at various points throughout his life. Let's take a look, shall we? Idealized influence, better known as charisma, was a key factor in his leadership. Not only was he well liked enough as a slave to be trusted by the Confederate officers meant to observe him and his crew, he also was so well liked he won a congressional election in South Carolina during the Reconstruction era. This is particularly noteworthy given the fact that South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union during the Civil War. Given this, we can tell from history he was incredibly well liked, and this gave him the idealized influence he needed. Next up, we have inspirational motivation, or simply inspiration to most. While he certainly inspired the crew of the Planter to act, we can observe that his inspirational skills were much greater. They were so great, some could argue that they shaped the history of this nation. Robert Smalls, by example and conversation, was able to inspire President Lincoln to allow black men into the Union Army for the first time. He inspired 5,000 black men to join the Union Army at that time. This very well could have been the difference maker over the course of the war. It's quite possible the war would have gone differently if not for this bolstering of the ranks. The next factor of transformational leadership is intellectual stimulation. This factor is all about stimulating followers. But I will say, this was and is the hardest to demonstrate in the case of Mr. Smalls, given how far back his story was, and the fact that most of his story required his followers to work in secrecy. This one could go either way, but given the other factors were so successful, we're going to move on under the assumption that this was at least adequate for a transformational leader. Finally, we have individualized consideration. This one is interesting, because it's all about trying to create a supportive climate for followers so they can share their individual needs. This is no doubt a difficult undertaking, especially under slavery. But even so, he did the absolute best he could under those circumstances. The escape was planned with input and feedback from his family, as well as the rest of the slave crew. Their concerns were addressed in private planning meetings. He explained the measures they were taking to prevent being captured, to set their minds at what ease there could be in a situation like this, and roles were planned out before the big day. Given all these factors, it's clear that Robert Smalls was a true transformational leader. He had a vision, not only for his life, but the lives of those around him. A vision of freedom, first for him, then his crew, and finally the country at large. And his vision steadily and repeatedly came through, one after the other. This has been Trevor Harold's presentation on Robert Smalls for Leadership 300. Thank you all so much for watching. Now go forth towards your own vision.